This is an interesting text, and it's probably one of the most misunderstood texts in Scripture, because we read this text wrongly, or at least we tend to. Jesus says, unless your virtue goes deeper than the virtue of the scribes and the Pharisees, you will not enter the kingdom of heaven. Now, the reason why we misunderstand that is because we always think that the scribes and Pharisees in their worst light. You know, the scribes and Pharisees, some of them were hypocritical, they opposed Jesus. But the scribes and Pharisees, don't get them wrong, they were the religious people of the time, the churchgoers, the theologians, the bishops, the priests, and so on. Today, we're the scribes and Pharisees, okay? They were the religious people of the time, and most of them were very good people. Jesus came from a school of the Pharisees, you know? And notice here, Jesus isn't saying if you are hypocritical like the scribes and Pharisees. Here he's talking about their virtue. Notice he says, your virtue has to go deeper than the virtue of the scribes and Pharisees. Now, what was the virtue of the scribes and Pharisees? Actually, it was a very high virtue. The scribes and Pharisees, in their religiosity, to be a virtuous person, you had to keep all the 10 commandments, and you had to be a person, a man or a woman of justice. Now, it's interesting. If you keep all the commandments and you're a just person, why isn't that enough? You'd think, you know, if you keep the commandments and you're a very fair person, why isn't that enough? That's still not mercy. Well, Jesus is going to define it. Jesus says your virtue has to go deeper than the virtue of the scribes and Pharisees. Why? He said, because anybody can love those who love you, just as anybody can hate those who hate them. Anybody can do good to those who do good to you, just as anybody can wish evil on those who do evil to you. He said, but I say to you, can you love an enemy? Can you do good to those who do harm to you? Ultimately, can you forgive a murderer? It's interesting. That's the key, the highest moral point of the New Testament in terms of explicit teaching. And this takes you further than virtually any moral teacher on earth. Notice Jesus says, you know, if you're fair, it's still not enough. See, because justice doesn't include mercy, you know. And he said, and besides, it's a little easier to do it. You know, if somebody loves you, it's easier to love them back. People come up to you and say, I think you're a great person, a great young priest, well, old priest. I'd say, well, you're obviously bright and you have good taste, and so on, you know. See, or someone comes up to you and say, I hate you. Well, I hate you too. Notice there's no virtue in that. You're just like an electrical cord. We just give back the energy that comes out to us, you know. And we spontaneously like the people who like us. We spontaneously hate the people who hate us. And actually, that's fair. It's fair. You may, in fairness, hate somebody who hates you, okay? Jesus said, I'm asking you something. I'm saying, love those who hate you. Forgive those who do evil to you, and ultimately forgive murderers. It's interesting, little footnote here. We've had popes since St. Peter. It was only the second last pope in our lifetime, John Paul II, who stood up and said, we shouldn't do capital punishment. Now, it's interesting, he didn't say capital punishment's wrong, because in fact, capital punishment is not wrong biblically. You're allowed to do capital punishment. John Paul said we shouldn't do capital punishment, even though we're allowed to do it. He said, because Jesus is calling us to something higher. See, Jesus says, forgive murderers. Jesus forgave his own murderers while they were murdering him. So he said, we're called to something higher. You can execute a criminal. Jesus said, but you shouldn't do it. You should forgive those who kill your kids. You know, you don't have to. See, the virtue of the scribes and Pharisees, justice in the commandments is still an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. You can hate somebody who hates you. See, Jesus here is defining mercy. He says, mercy is beyond justice. In justice, you can execute a criminal. In mercy, you forgive a criminal. In justice, you can hate somebody who hates you. In mercy, you say, no, you have to love those who hate you. It's interesting, you know, sometimes, again, in a little footnote, recently you've had a lot of stuff with, you know, because the religious right and left fighting with each other, and people oftentimes say, what's the litmus test to a Christian? What's the litmus test that makes you a Christian? And oftentimes people will pick a moral issue, abortion. That's the litmus test. Now, if you want the litmus test, this is the litmus test. Can you love and forgive an enemy? Can you forgive a murderer? That's the litmus test Jesus gives us. He said, that stretches you morally to where Jesus wants us to be. See, so mercy is beyond justice. In justice, you can execute a criminal. In mercy, you shouldn't. And actually, John Paul was very nuanced on his thing on capital punishment. He didn't say capital punishment's wrong. He said, in fact, capital punishment is allowable biblically. He said, but we shouldn't do it. You don't have to forgive an enemy, but you're supposed to. See, Jesus calls us, again, when Victoria talked that, the bigger mind. See, in the small mind, you don't have to forgive an enemy. The big mind calls you to forgive enemies, to love those who hate you. That's mercy, as Jesus defined it. Then, the next one. In John 2, compassion and mercy as giving voice to human finitude. I want to run you through a story here of Jesus that has many levels to it, and we only get the first level, and oftentimes don't miss some of the second and third levels of the story. And that's the famous story of the wedding feast of Cana. That's a story early on in John's Gospel, and interesting enough, it's a story preeminently about Mary, not about Jesus. This is the way John writes the story. He says, there was a wedding feast in Cana, and the mother of Jesus was invited to come, and Jesus also came along. So notice he's to tag along. Okay, so Jesus tags along. His mother is invited to this wedding in Cana. Now, interesting, too, in John's Gospel, remember, I think I told you this last week, in the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, that's one. The Synoptic Gospels, they write up Jesus from the point of view of his humanity. He's a human being who also is God. John reverses that. In John's Gospel, Jesus has no humanity. He is God from the beginning to the end. You know, the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and the Word became flesh. So in John's Gospel, Jesus has no humanity. So notice, Mary is going to a wedding feast, but she's taking God along. Okay? And also in John's Gospel, Mary has a unique role. John never mentions her name. If you didn't have the other Gospels, you wouldn't know what Mary's name is, you know. In the other Gospels, Mary is a prototype of discipleship. In John's Gospel, she isn't. In John's Gospel, she becomes Eve. And that's why he never gives it. She's always the mother of Jesus, or she's called woman. Okay, a generic title. You can see at the wedding feast of Cana, Jesus doesn't say mother, he says woman. Okay, so you're going to see there's two levels to this text. One is the level we get, the level of hospitality and so on. Mary talking to Jesus. You're going to see the deeper level is Eve, the mother of humanity, talking to God. Okay, so that's the setup. So the mother of humanity is invited to a wedding feast, and biblically a wedding feast means to the center of life. You know, in all archetypal literature, even fairy tales. Notice how all fairy tales end with a wedding? Every good fairy tale is to end with a wedding. The prince and princess get married and they live happily ever after. That's eschatology. That means that's heaven. Heaven is, and you live happily ever after. The genders come together, everything's complete, you live happily ever after. So the great texts in Scripture that deal with heaven, or the center of life on earth is symbolized by a wedding feast. So you have Mary and Jesus are going to the center of life. And at a second level, the mother of humanity, Eve, and God are going to the wedding feast. So they come there. This is the text. It said, at the heart of the feast, the mother of Jesus turned to Jesus and said, they have no wine. What an incredible thing to say. You know, because you notice wine is not a protein. Wine isn't a health food. Wine isn't something you need to sustain your life. Wine is an extra. Wine is about bubbliness of spirit, about celebration, about, celebrating life, about exuberance, what's beyond the ordinary, okay? Now, let's first take the surface level. And this is the way the text is often preached, and it's a valid way. And that is, see, Mary, she's a sensitive one. She comes to the wedding. They've run out of wine. And you probably don't have to guess why. Undoubtedly, it was some slip up, or they didn't have enough money, or whatever. See, and it's embarrassing for the people. Mary doesn't want them embarrassed. She's not interested. Not saying, well, I haven't had mine yet. Okay. She's trying to save the hosts from embarrassment. And so she goes to Jesus that they don't have any wine. Okay. Now, that's the surface level, and that's valid. You can preach on that. You know, the sensitivity, hospitality, also that Mary's the great intercessor. You can intercede with Mary, and she intercedes with Jesus. But that isn't the role, that the deeper part of this text, you know. See, what Mary is giving voice to, she's the mother. She's our mother, and she's the mother of humanity, and she's giving voice to human finitude. See, what mercy asks us to, that's a prophetic text. Mercy asks all adult Christians to voice what the poor can't voice. You know, the couple there who ran out of wine, they couldn't voice that. Mary voiced it for them, you know, and that symbolizes human finitude. There's a certain poverty at the heart of life. Somebody has to speak for that. See, Mary is a merciful person. She gives voice to human finitude. They have no wine, you know. And then it's interesting, Jesus says to her, woman, it's a heck of a thing to call your mother. I never said that to my mom. No, woman. He said, what's that to you and I? What's that to God? And what's that to Eve? Then he says, my hour has not yet come. And that's the part we also misunderstand. When Jesus says, my hour hasn't come, he isn't saying, you know, my hour to do miracles. He's not saying, you know, Mom, the Father and I have a schedule. And miracles kick in at about, you know, it's a 3-year schedule, about a year and a half in, we start doing miracles and so on. No, the hour he's referring to is not the hour to do miracles, it's the hour of his death, his suffering. He's saying, I'm not sure I'm the person who can provide the wine because I haven't had to put out blood yet, you know. But then, in fact, he does the miracle. And there's many aspects to it beyond. I just want to emphasize the mercy, the finitude thing. But in there, it's interesting. Notice the water that he turns into wine isn't the drinking water. You know, at the door of a Jewish house, there were always 6 jugs, and they each held about 18 gallons, and that was the water to wash yourself in, you know. So to go to the table, you had to oblate yourself, your hands and your feet, you know, and it was also needed because they walked barefoot in dust and so on. But it was also a symbolic thing. You could only go to the table if you were clean. So this was the water to wash yourself with so you'd be purified to go to the table. It's not the drinking water. They didn't drink that water. So Jesus turns that water into wine. He turns it into the best wine of all. And there the miracle, you know, which actually it's interesting. John at this stage doesn't use the word miracle. John said it was Jesus' first sign. See, miracles are too clear-cut. You don't have to think about a miracle. Guy walked on water. Well, that's something. You know, see, a sign you have to think about. So John says this was a sign that Jesus worked, because we need to think about it. And there's a double meaning to the water. First of all, what brings joy and life and wine into community is not necessarily the fiesta times. It's got to be the ordinary wash water, the laundry, the Monday morning. That's where joy has to happen. But also it's a symbol of the Eucharist. You know, in the beginning of John's Gospel, and we're going to look at another text in a few minutes, in the first chapters of John's Gospel are all this, where Jesus takes the old and he replaces it with the new. And here, part of the miracle or the sign is that you used to be worthy to go to the table, to the wedding feast, by washing yourself with this water, and now he turns it into wine that's also the wine of the Eucharist. The great act of washing yourself clean, the sacrament of reconciliation for Christians, penance and confession comes later, it's the Eucharist. The Eucharist, the primary sacrament of reconciliation, that's the way in this life you ready yourself to enter into the banquet. And because John is really complicated, notice in his gospel, the water becomes the wine, and then the wine's going to become the blood. And then at the end of John's gospel, when they pierce Jesus' side, blood and water flows out. So the blood and water flows back on humanity. This is symbol upon symbol upon symbol. But the point I want to make here in terms of mercy, he gives Mary this unique role. See, Mary is the merciful mother. Eve, the mother of humanity, she gives voice to human finitude. She's saying they don't have any wine. You know, I'm at the center of life, the center of the heart of humanity, and it's flat down here. They've got protein. Notice she didn't say, I looked in their fridge, and they only have Doritos and Coke, you know. They maybe had a lot of protein. They didn't have joy at the center of life. And so she gives voice to that. She gives voice to something very concrete. This poor couple didn't have enough money to do a proper wedding for their kid, you know. She voices that to God. See, so mercy, we're merciful adults to the degree that we give voice to human finitude. That's what prophets do. That's what true generative adults do. They worry about who hasn't got enough, and so on. It's interesting, Elizabeth Johnson, in her last book on Abounding Grace, she talks about how important it is to have more feminine images of God, you know. And she says, precisely for this reason, she says, any mother who's feeding 7 kids makes sure they all get some. Okay, she said, a feminine image of God would help us give more voice to human finitude here. Okay, that's number 3. Up to number 5. Okay. Then, Luke 10, compassion is reaching through the ecclesial and cultural norms to reach the poor. That is the famous story of the Good Samaritan. You know, again, these stories, they make a point all by themselves, but you've got to contextualize and tease them out. Okay. Now here, Jesus is defining mercy as something that reaches through the cultural and ecclesial norms of the time. So this is the story of the Good Samaritan. You know what? Let me repeat it briefly. Jesus says, one day a man was walking from Jerusalem to Jericho when he fell among robbers who beat him up and left him for dead by the ditch. And then a priest comes walking by. Now, the priest was the highest religious person. Surely he should stop. You know, but he doesn't stop. And the reason he doesn't stop is precisely because he's a priest. See, he couldn't stop. Not because he was busy, but see, he didn't know if this guy was dead. And if a priest touched a dead body, then he polluted himself, and he couldn't do sacrifice and so on. So this priest, precisely because he's religious, can't reach out to this person. Okay? So he passes by the other side of the road, very careful not to touch the wounded person. Okay? Then a scribe comes along. And see, the scribe represents wisdom. That's the smartest person in the country. Comes along, and he sizes this up, but he passes by the other side of the road. Now, we don't know his reasons, but obviously they have to do with human wisdom. You know, the way we say, don't give money to a street person, they're just going to drink it up, you know. And then you're enabling this. He probably did all his psychology courses and all his sociology of poverty, and he did the thing. No, I'm not really helping him. If I help him, and so on, you know, I'm enabling him, perhaps. So whatever his wisdom was, his wisdom made him pass by, which also makes us often pass by, you know. And you have that decision every time you stop at a corner, and there's somebody out there begging with a cardboard sign. Do you give him $1? Do you not? You've been told not to. You know, we're always told, don't give any money to these people, you know. Well, maybe he was told, don't help, you know. So anyway, he passes by. Then a Samaritan comes along. The Samaritan were the enemies of the Jews. So this guy comes along. He has every reason to kill this man. But Jesus says he was moved by human compassion. See, human compassion is something deeper than religiosity. It's something deeper than the wisdom of the classrooms and cultural wisdom. He said he was simply moved in his gut. And one human being to the other, he went across, he bound up the man's wounds, he took him to an inn, and then not only that, he wrote him a blank check. He said, I'm going away, and if you spend more money, I want to come back. I want to see this thing right to the end. See, image of human mercy. So first of all, mercy, there are times, like all of us in this room, we're religious. All of you have had, you know, courses and cultural wisdom with street people, with the poor. What do you do? What's wise? What isn't? And Jesus says sometimes mercy simply reaches right through that. Sometimes you got to bracket your religion. Sometimes you got to bracket all your university training and all your cultural norms. And you can say, this person needs my help. And you reach out. It's Jesus. You can't cut this parable any other way. You know, you can't rationalize this parable, you can't make it go away. And this is one of the central parables of Jesus, or people say today, well, no, really, you shouldn't be. It's interesting. I'll give you an example. Mother Teresa was canonized on Sunday, and not everybody was enthusiastic about her canonization, And one of the major things she was criticized about was for doing this. They said, well, she wasn't really helping these people, and, and social justice is correct. There's systemic reasons, and she was just treating the bodies, and she wasn't looking up the river, why these, and so on. And all of that is true, but she was the Good Samaritan. She just reached out, said, I don't care about, what people think, or if corporations are giving me the money or whatever. I'm just going to, this person's dying, and there's nobody there, I'm going to be there, Now, we also have to keep cultural norms and religion in mind, but here Jesus is saying, at times, mercy simply trumps all of that. There comes times when Jesus says, be danged about religion, be danged about university courses and even social justice and so on. Sometimes you simply have to reach out to this person. You also have to do mercy, social justice, and everything else. You know how they define the distinction between justice and social justice and charity? It's an important distinction. A lot of people don't get that. For instance, you can be a very charitable person and not a just person. You can be a very just person and not a charitable person. So this is the classical story and I used it in the book, The Holy Longing. They say, and this is the classical story, and we'll put it to the Good Samaritan. They say, once upon a time there was a town, and they lived down the bend from a river. And one day some kids were playing, and they went out and they found 5 bodies were floating down the river. So they called the adults and they quickly pulled these bodies out. 3 of them were dead, so they buried them. 1 was a kid, so they found a foster home for him. And 1 was a young man, and they rehabilitated him and gave him a job. And the next day they went out and a couple of more bodies came. And they went on for years. They'd go out every day and there'd be bodies coming on the river, and they would handle them. The kids they'd put to foster homes, put them in schools, the sick they would tend to, the dead ones they'd bury, and they did this for years. But they never thought of going up the river to see why those bodies were coming from. See, now there's charity. See, up the river, that's social justice. And it's very important to say, why are we producing bodies? Right now, if you watch the news, what's happening in Chicago that 60 people got killed in a week? Remember the police chief just yesterday said, this isn't a police problem, it's a society problem. What's causing those bodies? Now, Mother Teresa and the Good Samaritan are down the river. Notice Mother Teresa wasn't up the river looking at justice. She was saying, this person's sick, this person's leprosy, nobody can touch this person, I'll touch them. The Good Samaritan wasn't looking up the river. He didn't say, well, I wonder why the crime rate is high in Jericho. That's somebody else's job. This guy was lying in the ditch bleeding. He picked him up. See, so mercy, this parable, and you can't rationalize this parable away. People would like to, Well, you're not really helping this street person. You got to get him to a social agency, yes. But at a certain time, mercy is simply a direct one-to-one. And it's just that he was moved by human compassion. And he just went across the ditch and picked up this guy. And then his mercy was also unconditional. He said, I'm going to see this thing through to the end. If it costs more money, I'll pay it. He didn't say, he's out of my hands now, innkeeper, good luck. As the French say, arrangez-vous. I'm off. Okay.